Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me, Jessica, and then all the folks over at CEDAM to talk about broadband in Michigan. I'm going to talk about kind of the current status of things in the state of Michigan, some of the most recent developments going on at the state level and the federal level when it comes to broadband and how that's going to impact Michigan, and then some of the things that we're seeing on the ground for ways to expand broadband access, adoption, and use in primarily rural areas. Now, I have given this presentation a few times in the last couple of weeks, a similar presentation. So if you've seen me at the Michigan Farm Bureau's Legislative Day, the House Committee on Communications and Technology, or the Michigan Commission of Agriculture and Rural Development, you're going to see some of the same content. But again, the focus here is really on rural areas in Michigan, what things look like now for broadband, and what can be done to help expand broadband access, adoption, and use in those areas. So again, just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to first talk about infrastructure access, which is arguably one of the most important topics when it comes to broadband, is actually having connection. But then we're also going to talk about broadband technology adoption and use as well, because infrastructure is one thing, but without meaningful adoption and skills and the utilization of those network connections, broadband doesn't mean much and can't impact quality of life. So that's why we look at access, adoption, and use. We'll talk a little bit about the Connect Michigan Connected Community Program, which I know some of the folks on this call are participants of, and there's actually an entire team in Berry County listening in today. So we'll talk a little bit about that program, some of the things we're seeing from our rural communities that are participating in that program, and some of the ways that broadband is being expanded. And then, of course, again, like I said, recent developments in terms of broadband technology at the state and federal level that are going to be impacting technology in the state. So first, I want to provide you a little bit of context. I know some of you on the webinar are familiar with Connect Michigan, but for those who aren't, Connect Michigan is a subsidiary of Connected Nation, which is a nonprofit dedicated to expanding broadband access, adoption, and use throughout the country. And we are Michigan's expression of these core competencies, which include network mapping, validation and analysis, residential and business adoption research, local, state, and national policy analysis and capacity building, and community technology planning. I do have to say right up front that I am not a tech person. I'm not a network engineer or anything like that. I come from the world of urban and regional planning. So my focus is definitely on the community side of it. I like to say that I know just enough about technology and the internet to be dangerous, but I know how it benefits communities, and that's where our community planning program comes in, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So Connect Michigan as an entity was charged with implementing the State Broadband Initiative, or the SBI program, in Michigan from 2009 to 2014. Every state in the country had an SBI program similar to Connect Michigan that was tasked with broadband mapping, research, and community planning. And the purpose of that really was to expand broadband access, adoption, and use, but most importantly, to create the National Broadband Map. So all of the broadband mapping information that we have in Michigan goes to populate the National Broadband Map, which then gets used for subsidy decisions by the FCC for broadband expansion. We are partnered with the Michigan Public Service Commission. If you're not familiar with that organization, they regulate various things, including energy, gas, motor carrier freight, and telecommunications in Michigan. My office is right in their office, and they've been a good state partner of ours over the last 5 years. We do collaborate at all sorts of scales with a diverse group of stakeholders at the local, regional, state, and international levels to impact broadband in Michigan. We have 3 in-state staff, myself that directs the program, and Dan Manning and Tom Stevenson, who are both 2 Connect Michigan Community Technology Advisors that work with local communities to help them with our community planning program. And I'll get you their contact information at the end of this presentation in case you have specific questions. Dan Manning works with communities in southern Michigan, and Tom Stevenson in communities in northern Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula. We also host the annual Michigan Broadband Conference in Lansing. This will be our 3rd year for that event. We're still working on finding a date for that, but over the last 2 events that we've had in 2013 and 2014, We've seen more than 1,100 participants, and it grows every single year. So it's a good event to share best practices for expanding broadband. Overall, there is the way that we really express what we do is very simple in that we are tasked with facilitating the expansion of broadband. So we're not an internet service provider like AT&T or Comcast or anyone else, and we're not a government entity. Those of you in the nonprofit sphere know this very well, but we play in a very strange third space between those two entities to try and impact both the supply and demand side of broadband. And it's a very unusual place to be in, and it was all a part of the state broadband initiative from the federal government. So let's talk about broadband infrastructure or access in Michigan. This map that you see on the screen represents where we've seen broadband growth over the last 4 years of our program. So we published our very first broadband map in October of 2010 and our last broadband map in October of 2014. So anything that you see on this map that's highlighted in dark green, that's the most important color here, I think, that I've circled in red. Anything that's in dark green is broadband service that has been created in unserved areas since 2010. So we've seen quite a bit of broadband expansion into rural areas in the kind of the middle lower peninsula there, and then pockets in the upper peninsula where we've seen some expansion as well. The light green color represents where redundant broadband service has been created since 2010. So there was already service in existence there. Now there is new service, new competition, more providers offering service in these light green areas. And then the tan color at the very bottom, the unserved areas, which is most of the upper peninsula, and some tip of the mitt areas are places where there still is no broadband service. So those three areas, those three colors, the dark green, the light green, and the tan, are probably the most critical to look at on this map. And for the blue areas in southern Michigan, that's where broadband service existed since 2010, but no other broadband service has been implemented since then. So this just gives you an idea of where we've seen connections and access growth since 2010. Now, I want to talk numbers for a little bit, and then I'll get back to the maps. But when we look at broadband, everybody always asks, what is broadband? Well, it's essentially an internet connection that's anything but dial-up, if that makes sense. So back in 2009, when the State Broadband Initiative program started, the FCC defined broadband at 768 kilobytes per second. That's a connection that's barely better than dial-up, but at that time was still considered broadband. So that's where we start mapping. We map broadband connections at 768 kilobytes per second and faster. To give you an idea of what that speed means, it would take you quite a bit of time to download a movie, to download an album from iTunes on that type of a connection. Now, because we know that the demand for broadband is ever increasing, which usually means more and more speed for residents and businesses, we map all the various speeds of broadband, and you see those represented here in this chart. So all the way on the left, we have 768 kilobytes per second, and all the way on the right, we have 50 megabytes per second. We actually map speeds faster than 50 megabytes per second, but this is where I chose to stop for the purposes here. The green bar on this chart represents the percent of households that had access to the various speed tiers in October of 2010. So in October of 2010, approximately 97% of households in the state had access to 768 kilobytes per second, or the very most basic speeds of broadband. And then in October 2014, that number jumped to 99.1%. Now, remember, this is household availability, not geographic area, and so we'll talk about that here in a second. So between October 2010 and October 2014, we've seen some marginal increases in broadband speeds at 10 megabytes per second or less. We have seen some exceptional increases in the availability of faster broadband at 25 megabytes per second and 50 megabytes per second during that same time period. So you can see that in 2010, only 11.4% of households had access to 25 megabytes per second, and now 88.7% have access to speeds at that level. Now, the reason we map speed tiers is because the FCC continues to change their definition of broadband. So you can see kind of the definition of broadband history over here on the left. In 2009, you see the 768 kilobytes per second. In 2012, the FCC updated that to 4 megabytes per second. In 2014, very briefly, the definition was 10 megabytes per second, and then in January of this year, the FCC voted to increase that definition of advanced broadband service to 25 megabytes per second. So the bar is constantly raised when it comes to what qualifies as broadband, and thus our mapping and our efforts to expand broadband in the state are expanded as well. I also included some goals of the National Broadband Plan on here to give some perspective. By 2020, the FCC would like to see 100 million homes with connections to 100 megabytes per second download and 50 megabytes per second upload. I don't have any stats on where we currently stand with that, but I'm fairly certain it's not quite to 100 million homes yet. So the important thing to remember about this chart is that this is percent household availability, but especially when it comes to rural areas, this information does not translate geographically. So that's why our mapping is very important. So the map that I have on the screen now represents places in the state of Michigan that anything that's in red or pink has access to 3 megabyte per second broadband. And the darker the color, the more providers there are in that location that serve that speed. So it directly correlates to competition. So the darker the color, the more competition there is at this particular speed tier faster. So you can see that there's quite a bit of white space still in south central Michigan, northeast Michigan, even northwest Michigan, and the Upper Peninsula that do not have access to this 3 megabyte per second speed tier. And now remember, the FCC's new definition of broadband is 25 megabytes per second. So we're looking at 3 megabytes per second right now. Now, as we progress through the speed tiers, this is the exact same map. Now we're only showing 10 megabytes per second, though, with the same provider density. So again, the darker the color, the more providers there are in that area that serve 10 megabytes per second. If you were to look at a map of Michigan's household density, these maps would look almost identical because broadband deployment typically follows household density. The more customers there are in a particular area, the denser the households, in other words, typically the faster speeds there'll be, the more competition there'll be. So you can see that at the 10 megabyte speed tier, that service at this level definitely drops off in more rural areas, as seen by the white on this map. Now let's jump to the FCC's new definition of broadband at 25 megabytes per second. It's a very similar map to the 10 megabyte per second map, but even less area of the state has access to 25 megabytes per second. Again, though, that's the white area on here. So again, the darker the color, the more providers there are that offer 25 megabyte per second service. And again, this typically follows household density. Some of the technology that can provide 25 megabytes per second includes broadband over cable, Comcast, Charter, and the others. AT&T's Uverse product can get to 25 megabytes per second in some areas. Fiber to the home can certainly reach 25 megabytes per second. And some fixed wireless applications can reach these speeds. So those are the primary technologies that are delivering this kind of speed, but you can see there's quite a bit of white area still left on this map that does not have access to 25 megabytes per second. So that gives you an idea of the access challenges that we're up against. So now I'm going to show you the inverse of this map. So this map represents household density that does not have access to 25 megabytes per second or faster. So the darker the color on this map, the more households there are that don't have access to the infrastructure. And this map really gives us our direction and marching orders for what parts of the state need assistance in infrastructure construction and better connections for residents, businesses, institutions, and communities across the state. So again, this is household density that does not have access to 25 megabytes per second or faster. So our maps tell us where the infrastructure is and is not. They tell us about competition. They tell us about speed and all sorts of different variables when it comes to the broadband industry in the state. But our statewide research tells us about adoption and use. And like I said at the beginning, you can have all the access and the infrastructure you want, but without meaningful adoption and the skills to be able to use it, it's not going to do you much good. So that's why we study residential and business adoption in the state of Michigan and work to understand why folks don't have broadband or why they're not adopting. According to our research in 2014, approximately 2 million adults in the state of Michigan do not have access to broadband at home. And when we ask them why they don't, these are their answers. So 37% of folks that don't have broadband at home state some sort of issue with awareness. I don't feel I need the internet. I don't know what it is. I'm getting by without it as a typical awareness issue. 14% cite cost as the biggest barrier to broadband adoption, as broadband is a fairly unregulated industry, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit too, but the cost can vary widely depending on the technology and the provider and your location. Digital literacy is the third highest barrier to broadband adoption, and that would include responses like, I don't know what broadband is, I don't know how to use a computer, I don't know how to use the internet. Those are some of the issues that we face. And then there's other issues as well. People access the internet elsewhere. They say it's not available, so that's the infrastructure response. So given the percent of households that have access to broadband in the state of Michigan, we still see about 25% of households that don't adopt it. So there's a gap there. Now, when it comes to businesses, and businesses is something that Connect Michigan focuses very heavily on, getting more businesses to adopt technology. We do the same thing. We run the same surveys. So there's approximately 20% of businesses in the state of Michigan that don't use the internet. That represents about 53,000 different establishments. And the number one reason they cite that they don't use the internet is because they don't need it or they're getting by without it. 18% say that they don't use a computer. 2% say that it's not available. 3% say it's too expensive. It's 4% too complicated, and so on. So these are some of the barriers that we're trying to understand. Why, if infrastructure is available, why aren't businesses and residents adopting it? Now, like I said, Connect Michigan likes to focus on businesses, given there's supposedly coming out of an economic recession now, but given Michigan's economic downturn over the last few years, how can businesses turn to technology to sustain and grow themselves here in the state without having to close up shop or move? So this is a kind of a tip of the iceberg look at some of the stats that we collect on businesses in the state when it comes to broadband and technology. And we work to address some of these things with businesses and some of the high-speed connectivity issues that businesses might face. I'll talk about a new map that we have here in a little bit that's going to help solve some of the issues you see here on the screen. So if our maps tell us about the infrastructure issues we have in the state, and our research tells us about adoption and use issues that we're facing, what are we doing about it? I think that's the most important question. And that's where our community technology planning program comes in. That's called Connected, the Connected Community Engagement Program. It's a fairly simple process where we establish a very diverse team of community stakeholders, and these teams represent all sectors of the local economy. It's healthcare, education, libraries, chambers of commerce, economic development, local government, public safety, you name it. We invite these folks to get together to talk about local broadband issues. And we also bring broadband providers and technology providers to the table as well. We help communities assess their local broadband and technology landscape based on standards from the National Broadband Plan. So any community in Michigan could compare themselves to any other community in the country based on the data. We help develop a plan to fill in the gaps and local technology issues identified through that assessment process, and then help communities implement those projects to increase the access, adoption, and use of technology throughout the community, and then achieve what we call connected certification. And that's a moniker that comes from Connect Michigan and Connected Nation to recognize communities that are putting forth a plan and implementing it to solve local technology issues. It's not an end point. That definitely needs to be made clear, is that certification through our program is not an end point. It's a launching of an effort and a recognition of work done to date, and an actual recognition of work to be done to expand broadband throughout that community. Through our federal grant, we were funded and required to work with 14 communities in the state of Michigan, and we're actively working with more than 3 times that many, simply because there's demand. So any community that you see highlighted in the map on the right has an active community planning team in it. They already have a plan complete, or they are a connected certified community in the state of Michigan. Looking at some residential adoption numbers for communities that are working in our program. certified communities have a higher broadband adoption rate than the state as a whole and the U.S. average. Communities without plans, who started far below the state and national average in 2010, are making great headway in increasing broadband adoption. They're lower than the state average, but higher than the national average. And then we find that participating communities have a higher rate of businesses with an online presence than the state as a whole. So these are some of the things that we're seeing coming out of the communities that we're working with. Now, most importantly, this is not an advertisement for this program per se, but most importantly, the things that come out of these communities are what they are doing now to expand broadband access, adoption, and use throughout their communities. And this is by no means a laundry list of the things that are going on across the state. We have many, many stories and many, many examples and best practices of folks who are really making a difference when it comes to technology in their communities that may not have been participating or taking part in something like this in their day-to-day jobs. So some of the projects that are being implemented across the state include website and social media classes for businesses, digital literacy campaigns between educational institutions and libraries, residential and business surveys to identify access issues and areas of demand. That's something that we do in almost every community we go to, that the providers really respond to in helping, again, affect the demand side of the broadband equation, thus increasing the supply. We've had communities that have modified their zoning ordinance language and other ordinances and policies to lower any regulatory barriers to broadband expansion while still maintaining community character and implementing their vision. We've seen awareness and support campaigns for educational one-to-one device programs. If any of you are in a community where their school has gone to a one-to-one either iPad or laptop type device program, it's important for broadband connections for those kids at home after school so they can have access to all the resources they would normally have at school. So we've seen a big push to support programs like that, especially in rural communities. We've definitely seen public-private partnerships for infrastructure expansion. I'll talk about one example of those, but that's a model that we've been seeing across the state in helping to expand infrastructure into the most rural parts of the state. We've seen a trend toward a more localized township-level action planning. As most communities that participate in our program have kind of a more populated center, it's the rural townships and the rural areas that do get left out when it comes to infrastructure, as evidenced by our maps. So we've seen some very pinpoint type township level action planning to take care of some of those issues. And again, most of our community broadband plans support small businesses in some way. Again, whether it's for website and social media development classes, doing a technology mentorship program, helping new business incubators and facilities get a faster speed connection. Those are some of the things that the 45 communities that we work with are doing to expand their local access, adoption, and use. And if you have an interest in doing any of these things, all you have to do is let us know, and we'll point you to the folks on the ground that are doing it in another community to help share their experience and share their thoughts and advice on doing something similar. So I did want to talk about that public-private partnership a little bit. This is an example out of Clare County, right there in central Michigan. And in 2011, Clare County was one of the most unserved counties in the state of Michigan. The map on the left here, anything in yellow, orange, I guess I'll call that burnt sienna, that you see on this map, did not have access to broadband at 3 megabytes per second. So the darker the color, the more households there were in that area that did not have access to infrastructure. By developing a public-private partnership between the schools, libraries, local government, the cities and the townships, and a broadband provider, they were able to expand service into the rural areas, and they started mostly with the eastern side of the county. So the map on the right is their unserved household density map 1 year later in October of 2012, and you can see that they increased their broadband household availability by 19 percentage points in a year by implementing this public-private partnership. So what they did is they leveraged unused portions of existing fiber ring that the public entities use, the schools, libraries, and local government, to increase the capacity for fiber spurs to the rural areas. The townships helped share the cost of tower construction, and the internet service provider installed equipment on those towers, leased the tower space, and then is able to provide service to the residents there and also service to the township governments themselves so they can be better connected. So this was a public-private partnership that worked out very well, and we've seen similar conversations to this across the state. Some other models for success in rural communities. I think one of the, and there's no specific model on here, but knowing your broadband providers is probably the best way to kickstart conversations about expanding infrastructure. Now that might sound silly, but Connect Michigan through our mapping program works with more than 150 broadband providers in the state of Michigan, and I know that there's upwards of 200 broadband providers in Michigan, and it's likely that there's places in the state that have access to more than just what you think of as a broadband provider, such as AT&T, Comcast, Charter, Frontier. There's likely other providers that can serve you, especially in rural areas where some of the more wired technologies don't typically get out to. So this is an example from Osceola County, where there was a broadband provider that went out of business and left a lot of people offline. They were able to get service for a year or so, and then the company went out of business. And because Osceola County was part of our program, and they knew to ask us who were some other broadband providers that could come into the community, they were able to work with a different broadband company called Casair, who would come in and turn some equipment on the towers and was able to serve these residents again, simply because they knew who their broadband providers were and felt comfortable having that conversation. So again, we on our website, and I realize the irony of having to go online to look up who your broadband providers are, which can be difficult if you don't have broadband, but it is the fastest way to get this information out there. We do have maps of broadband providers and their service territories and county profiles that list every provider in the county. If you don't want to go to our interactive map and enter your address, you can go to our county profiles, and it'll list every single broadband provider that has network that touches that county. And that's a really good place to start having these conversations. And again, asking us for help to find a local provider's representative is also a great way to do it. If anybody's ever tried to call AT&T, Frontier, Comcast, that's not a customer service type issue, knows it can be tough to find somebody who knows anything about your local area, especially you folks in economic development and local government. So we have contacts, local contacts for a lot of these companies that are more than willing to come to meetings. Even the national providers in the state of Michigan send representatives to almost every single one of our meetings where they have network because they find value in knowing the communities and having the communities know them. So we can find you a local representative. And another thing is site surveys and signal testing. And I had a video on this, but I'm not going to show the video today. It's on our website. But what some of these companies will do, they'll come out to the site that maybe you have a business that needs better connected, or a resident, or a rural township hall, and they'll come out and do some signal testing free of charge to see if they can get what kind of service they can get out there. And again, knowing the local representatives and knowing who your providers are is a great way to start that conversation. And like I said, there are technology adoption is as critical as infrastructure access in rural areas. And a couple of years ago, Connect Michigan partnered with CEDAM to implement a program called the Small Business Technology Task Force Project, where we wanted to tell the story of businesses who are using the internet in creative ways to sustain and grow themselves, to hopefully build the awareness for why other businesses should have the internet. You saw that in my chart previously on business adoption that the number one reason that businesses don't adopt broadband is they just feel they don't need it. So we want to show them that need and how they could sustain and grow their business, leveraging technology. And just a few examples of the way that that can be done is through the adoption of point of sale software, social media, website development, crowdfunding, inventory control are all meaningful uses of technology for rural, small, and micro businesses. And as part of that project, CEDAM actually produced a Bright Side episode that highlights businesses across the state that are doing all of these things, small and micro businesses that are doing these things. So if you want to go to CEDAM's website, you can check that out. It's a great video to show to folks who are interested in broadband adoption or who might be on the fence about why they should adopt. And again, the adoption and use is the demand side of the equation. So increasing adoption and use helps spur demand, which then helps increase the supply of network connections So again, that's where Connect Michigan plays, is to increase the supply and demand of broadband in the state. So now I want to spend some time talking about recent developments impacting Michigan when it comes to broadband and technology. Some of these things you may have heard about in the news. Some of them may have been a little quiet, but that's our job, is to stay on top of these things and translate that to you so you can see how it'll affect Michigan. So first, I want to talk about what's called Public Act 52 of 2014, and this is a state-based change that happened last year that modified the Michigan Telecommunications Act. And what it does is it allows incumbent local exchange carriers, aka phone companies, to discontinue landline service if a comparable voice service exists in that same area. So this may have been referred to in the news as the landline bill. It may have also been referred to as the carrier of last resort bill. So previous to this public act, there wasn't a mechanism that allowed a phone company to pull out of an area. It was mandated that every area in the state of Michigan had to have phone service, and somebody had to be that carrier of last resort. This change to the law now allows a phone company to pull out landline service if there are comparable voice services in that area. Now, comparable voice services, as defined in the law, include what's called VoIP, or Voice over Internet Protocol, which can be delivered by broadband and wireless technologies. So the comparable voice service qualification for them to remove landline service is very broad. It can include VoIP over a broadband network, which can be delivered by a multitude of technologies, or it could include mobile wireless service in that area. Carriers can discontinue their service now, but there's a reduction in the requirement to discontinue service that happens on January 1st, 2017. So we haven't seen any carriers that have proposed discontinuing service yet, but it is expected to begin in 2017 when the requirement to do so does get reduced. Now, when this happens, a carrier is required to file with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, which then notices the Michigan Public Service Commission, and then they have to notice their customers, and the customers are given a 60-day notice that landline service is going away, and they will find they are then tasked with finding an alternative voice service or comparable voice service if that's what they would like to do. So we are working through a lot of this with various organizations, but some of the things issues that we've noticed with this law are implications for 911 service, in making sure that when you call 911 over a VoIP or wireless technology, that they know where you are. It has implications for health monitoring devices and personal emergency devices. So the I've fallen and I can't get up buttons is a personal emergency device, and typically these work on a landline or analog-based network, not a digital network. Some of the other items that it affects are electronic tethers that are court-ordered, which typically are checked in using an analog system, fax machines, unless you have a digital fax or computer-based fax, and some home security systems, although there's many digital-based or IP-based home security systems now. But more traditional ones do rely on an analog phone system type network. So these are some of the things that we're keeping tabs on and considering in our assistance to the Michigan Public Service Commission as this law gets implemented over the next few years, and then in 2017 when we expect the discontinuance of service to begin. So the law did task the Michigan Public Service Commission with creating and maintaining a database of all options, of all comparable voice service options, so that consumers can identify alternative providers if need be. So that is our task with the Michigan Public Service Commission, is creating this database. So because voice service can be delivered over broadband and wireless, there is very good reason to keep our broadband mapping program going, refining those maps and adding a voice component to it to make sure that consumers are aware of all the options should a discontinuance of service occur in the area. So again, keep an eye out for information on this if it's something that you're concerned with, or if there's other stakeholders in your community that are concerned with it. and we can definitely help answer questions, and hopefully we'll be providing consumers with a lot more information here as this new database gets developed. Another Michigan Act, Public Act 564 of 2014, opened up the Michigan Public Safety Communications System towers to co-location by other entities. So what that means is there are 206 towers across the state of Michigan that are owned by the Michigan Public Safety Communications System. And previous to this law, Verizon or AT&T or anyone else could not locate their equipment on these towers to serve broadband or mobile wireless service. Well, this law changed that. These towers are quite tall and strategically located throughout the state, as you can see on this map. Those little tower symbols are the 206 towers. And it's quite a bit of vertical real estate where private companies can now locate their equipment. The one caveat to this law is that in order to qualify for co-location, the tower must be in an area that is unserved at that 3 megabyte per second speed tier. The areas on this map marked in pink are areas that have that 3 megabyte per second service, but any area in orange or without a color like you see in the Upper Peninsula would qualify for this for co-location on these towers. So this will have a big impact in the Upper Peninsula, where there's currently not a lot of service in the most rural areas, and then South Central Michigan, where there's quite a few pockets that don't have 3 megabyte per second service, and tip of the net areas that still have pockets of unserved. So we're looking forward to the process for allowing companies to co-locate on these towers, and hopefully it'll impact the coverage in rural areas. This is a new product from Connect Michigan in collaboration with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. We have taken our broadband mapping to the next level in that we want to show where Michigan's fastest infrastructure is. Google Fiber has gotten a lot of press in the last few years about fiber to the home connections. Fiber to the home has been talked about quite a bit in the Lansing and Detroit areas very recently. So what we've done is we worked with Michigan's fiber providers and created a map of their fiber routes and fiber service areas. This is the first time this information has been made publicly available by any state or public entity. It is a voluntary mapping program. Providers and carriers do not need to participate in this program. There's nothing that mandates them to. But we have more than half of the fiber providers represented on this map. When you click on this map or enter your address, it provides you with a list of fiber carriers, or ultra-high-speed carriers, I should say, because it's not just fiber, that fall into three categories. The first is carriers that have fiber within a quarter mile of where you clicked, carriers with 100 megabyte per second service or faster, and a list of known fiber providers in the municipality where you click. So this is a very long list that this gives you, and there's a sample of it in a fairly blurry picture here in the middle of the screen. And this is the Alpena area that you see on the map. So when you click, you can see All-Band has fiber service area. They also have fiber in the township. Charter has 100 megabyte per second service where I clicked here, and all these other companies have fiber in the area. So the purpose behind this map was for local governments and economic development corporations and others to know where Michigan's fastest infrastructure is for site selection, business attraction, business expansion, and for the provider community themselves to know who else they might be able to connect to carry traffic back to the internet. So the map is available at miconnects.org, and you can visit the map and try it out for yourself. Now we're going to switch from state to federal level programs that are going on. A few years ago, the FCC created the Connect America Fund, and what this fund does is it transitions what's called the Universal Service Fund, or USF. And if you look on your phone bills, everybody has a USF charge that they're billed for monthly that goes into this fund that previously subsidized support for phone systems, but they're transitioning that subsidy to broadband build-out. There is a mobile and a wired component to this, and I know the yellow on this map is very, very bright and sometimes tough to see, but anything in yellow or blue on this map are areas that are eligible for this subsidy. Very recently, actually just earlier this week, we received the census block list from Frontier and CenturyLink of the places that they're going to build out based on this new subsidy. And I have Frontier's map in here to show you. While it doesn't look all that extensive, but the green census blocks that are highlighted in this map, and again, they're kind of pocketed throughout the state. Those green areas represent about 22,000 households, according to their filing. So these are the places that they plan to implement that subsidy, and get folks better connected in these census blocks. So we do look forward to additional filings from the providers who are accepting this funding in the state of Michigan in future years and to map and show where there's going to be expansion in the near future. Also, as part of the Connect America Fund transition, the FCC created what's called the Rural Broadband Experiment Program. And this is a brand new program, and it's the first time that the FCC has subsidized or supported new and innovative deployments of broadband with funding that was only available to certain types of carriers. So now they're opening up that funding opportunity to a wide variety of providers and communities and others to see what kind of innovative solutions there might be to expanding rural infrastructure. This is a list of those in Michigan that filed an initial expression of interest in the Rural Broadband Experiment Program. And we're kind of in a holding pattern right now on this one, as we're waiting for the FCC to decide on waivers, additional rules, the path forward before there'll be deployment and funding from this program. But again, there was quite a bit of interest in this program from the state of Michigan. The FCC received thousands of expressions of interest from across the country, but these are the ones from Michigan. If you recognize any of these companies, they were excited about this program and interested in participating. One other announcement from January, President Obama made an announcement from Iowa that kind of were packaged together as his community broadband initiative. And there were several things in that initiative that we've been tracking and that we will translate to stakeholders in Michigan as more information becomes available. But he plans to host a broadband summit in June of 2015 to, again, share best practices for expanding broadband for communities in rural areas. He has established the Broadband USA Technical Assistance Program, which is put on by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA, the same organization that funded the state broadband initiative that we were part of. He is revamping the USDA's Rural Utility Service Broadband Loan Program. This is a loan program administered by the USDA in the state of Michigan and across the country to help fund broadband expansion projects in rural communities. So they're revamping that to lower the requirements to participate in that program. So that's good news for rural areas. They're forming a Federal Broadband Opportunity Council, which is a kind of an internal federal entity that will be looking at best practices for community broadband. And he made a call to end state laws that restrict municipal broadband initiatives. And this may have an impact on the Michigan Telecommunications Act. The FCC very recently issued an order that preempts the municipal broadband restrictions in 2 states. And it is expected that they may take action to preempt all states that have restrictions on municipal broadband networks. Now, in Michigan, the Michigan Telecommunications Act does not outright permit or outright ban municipal broadband networks, but there are several steps and barriers for municipalities and in communities to become their own internet service provider. So it'll be interesting to see how any changes to or preemption by the FCC to these laws would impact Michigan, just because we're not an outright ban. So it'll be interesting to see when and if any of that action happens and how it'll impact Michigan. But you'll be sure to get information on it as we keep tabs on all this information. So finally, the last bit, and I'm sure you've seen things in the news on net neutrality. And I don't have a lot of answers for you today because the full order was just released at the end of last week that we are still in the process of digesting, distilling, and translating for folks. But essentially what happened was that the FCC voted to reclassify broadband providers from being electronic communication service to common carrier under a regulation of Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. And common carrier is an interesting term. In the telecommunications sense, and I'm oversimplifying here, but common carrier typically refers to phone companies. They're regulated as common carriers. And a common carrier is any entity that is a gateway to commerce. So other common carriers would include bridges, toll roads, railroads, hotels, airlines. All are treated as common carriers because they are a gateway to commerce. And that's the idea here as well. So the intent of this regulation is to prevent providers from blocking subscriber access to legal content, throttling of lawful internet traffic, and paid prioritization of content, which I think is one of the biggest pieces of net neutrality is that paid prioritization. For the first time, this law would apply to both fixed and mobile broadband carriers, which is an interesting approach by the FCC. So again, the full order was just released, and we're working to distill that, but we should have a policy brief on that out here in the next, I would say, no more than a week or so. That'll really distill this down a little bit more and be able to show the impact that it'll have on communities. But I did want you to have a little bit of information on net neutrality and some of the other things that we're looking at. And we do currently have policy briefs at Connected Nation's website, connectednation.org. Our policy team in Washington, D.C. follows this stuff very closely, and there's lots of policy briefs there if you're interested in any more detail on some of the FCC's actions. So I've taken up just over 45 minutes here, and now we can take a few questions. I see that there's a couple questions in the chat box that I'll address here in a second, but I do want to make sure that you have this contact information. So my email address, Tom Stevenson's email address, if you're at a community in northern Michigan or the Upper Peninsula, he works with communities there and has lots of great local information. Dan Manning similarly works with communities in the southern Lower Peninsula and has been doing a great job there to get communities that are connected and provide lots of information. So both of those guys have great information, especially when it comes to local stories or examples or ideas for what you might want to do to help expand broadband access adoption. And of course, our website, www.connectmi.org, has maps, research, and information. And then the fiber map from MEDC is www.miconnects.org. If that's not confusing, I'm not sure what is. So connectmi.org, miconnects.org for those two websites. But I think what I'll do is there's 3 questions in the box, so I'll go ahead and answer those, and then we can open it up for any others. Let's see. First question is, how can you find out or get access to your local completed community connectivity plan? That's a very good question. So on our website, the connectmi.org, you can go to our county profiles, and I'm gonna open it up here so I know exactly where you head. So go to connectmi.org, Learn tab at the top of the page. You can hover over that and then scroll down to county profiles, and then you can select your county from the drop-down list. And then at the bottom of that page, if the county has a plan that's been published and released, the bottom of the county profile for that county will have the technology assessment and the community technology plan available there. So they're all on our website. The second question, are there efforts to get Charter and AT&T to map their fiber on the MEDC fiber map? It's my understanding that the map only shows in purple the Merit fiber routes. While it is true that AT&T and Charter did not give us their specific fiber routes for this map out of a corporate national policy, the big companies are included on this map if they have fiber in a local municipality. So you can click on a rural township, click on a small town, and if Charter or AT&T has fiber that goes through that municipality, it'll show you, it'll tell you that. We don't know exactly where it is because they didn't give us their fiber routes, but it'll tell you if they have fiber within that community. Now, because Michigan has such a gridded township system, most townships being 6 miles by 6 miles, you can get fairly specific about some of the locations of these larger providers that did not give us their fiber routes for the map. So they are included on the map, but they don't show the specific routes. Now the areas in purple on that map, let me go back to it. The areas in purple on this map are not just Merit fiber. Merit does participate in this mapping program. Their fiber is on here. But there are, I believe, 24 other fiber providers on here as well, including U.S. Signal, Level 3, Comlink, Peninsula Fiber Network, Lynx Network, a whole host of others. So yes, Merit is participating on this map, but there are many, many other fiber providers that are included on this map as well. And we are constantly conducting outreach to get more of them on the map, and we've been very successful at that. We are also working to include publicly owned fiber on this map. For example, the Genesee County ISD, they have a pretty extensive fiber network that they're interested in leasing out in a public-private partnership. So their fiber is on this map. So that's another layer of information that we want to add is public infrastructure that could be leveraged in a public-private partnership for broadband expansion. The other question was where will we be able to find the policy brief? The policy brief that we publish is on Connected Nation's website. So again, Connect Michigan is a subsidiary of Connected Nation. So the website is connectednation.org. And on that website, you can go to the data center and policy, and all of the policy briefs will be there, as well as any of our filings that we file at the FCC. So you can see all of that information on Connected Nation's website because it is a national policy office that they're hosted on Connected Nation's website, and that again is connectednation.org, and that's under the data center for policy, and that's where all that information is. So those are the only 3 questions I see in the box. Are there any others?
Eric, this is Jessica. I actually have a quick question about PA 52. As far as allowing the landlines to pull out if there is comparable service, are they taking into consideration what happens if people lose power in those areas that don't have landlines?
That's a good question, and I need to add that to this list here. That is one of the problems with a VoIP or a wireless phone system is that when your battery dies, so does your phone service. So that will be something to be considered here. The changes to the Michigan law don't specify anything about battery backup, but the law stay with me for a second because it's kind of a roundabout way. The Michigan law references the FCC's IP trial order, which is an order that allows companies to do a trial of a discontinuance of service to see how it works. And there's many, many rules and regulations in that trial order that does include battery backup. So the Michigan law does talk about battery backup, but only referencing the FCC's trial order in the law. But that is one of the biggest issues. I do know that some broadband companies, when they install a VoIP product, do install battery backups on the outside of homes. But typically those battery backups don't last more than 12 hours. Don't quote me on that, but that's some of the anecdotal things that we've heard. So it definitely will be an issue considering some of the weather events and power outage events that we've seen in Michigan over the last few years. Power for those devices is definitely going to be an issue in a discontinuance of service situation.
Great, thanks. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to type them in. In the meantime, actually I have one more question. If communities are interested in your Connected Community Engagement program, are there things that they can do to prepare for that program that might make it easier going in for you, or?
Yeah, actually the best thing to do is to get people together. Whenever we go to a community, we typically find a community champion. Let me bring up my map of communities here. So we try and find a community champion, and that's somebody that can kind of take up the charge and be our liaison to that community. And a community champion can come from anywhere. In Berry County, it's Valerie Burns, who's the head of the Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Corporation there. In Clare County, it's the Emergency Management Director for the county. So people come from all walks and all sectors to be community champions. But the best thing a community champion can do, if that's the type of folks that I'm talking to on the phone here today, is to start getting people together, bring together school superintendents who are interested in technology, the libraries, the healthcare institutions, the institutions of higher ed, the chambers of commerce, the economic development, all these folks, bringing these folks together to have a talk about broadband and technology is the best place for us to start. So getting all those people in a room is very tough for us to do, but it's something that community champions do every day. So bringing those folks together, I think, is one of the first steps, and figuring out if you've got issues, what they are, and then calling us in to help. I think that's the best way to go about it.
Great.